I think I first became aware of the liminal, perhaps, without being aware of it as a child, when I had one of these experiences, and it was at Corfe Castle, and we were on a family holiday, and I just had this really strong sense that there was something beyond myself, or something greater than myself, something that was inexplicable, something I couldn't put my finger on, and I didn't know why or what it could possibly be. And but as a child, you don't sit in the car and say to your parents, "Oh, I think I've been in touch, and I think I've had a numinous experience." You know, I just thought this is something different, and I don't quite know what it is, but I felt the power of it. So I've always kind of had, but I've always had this sort of fascination with the esoteric, I guess. I was lucky enough to have a mother who had all sorts of psychic experiences, so, but whilst living in a very, very non-esoteric home. So those things my mum couldn't re-explain to us, but she would say what had happened, and so it didn't seem extraordinary to me, but it was pretty much dismissed by the family, I think, as, "Oh, that's Mum again, you know, she's gone off on one of those," and that was fine. But this fascination kind of lasted. I think maybe I should give you a brief explanation, as much as you can, of what the liminal is. I mean, limen, the Latin for limen, is a threshold. And so liminal space, in its literal sense, if you're looking at the simplest definition, is those places in between, when you're on the cusp, when you're stepping over into something new, when you're between what's known and the unknown. So if that's a definition of liminal space, when I started to think about it, that can be applied to so much, can't it? It's not one thing. Where you find liminal space is such a broad definition. So I said I'd talk a little bit about how the book came about. It was quite interesting. So I've had this fascination without really knowing completely why, and I'd read things, and I'd sometimes see something talking about the feeling that I'd had as a child at Corfe Castle, and I think, well, that's sort of what we're talking about, but it could be all sorts of different areas, so I wasn't sure exactly what we were talking about here. And I used to edit Kindred Spirit magazine, and work on Kindred Spirit, which is an amazing opportunity, a wonderful thing to do, a wonderful career to have. And through it, I knew other people in book publishing world, at Watkins and other book places, and one of the publishers, commissioning editors at Welbeck, would sometimes get in touch just to see, and she'd say, "Oh, what sort of things are trending at Kindred? What sort of things are you getting inquiries about?" And I would list things. She'd say, "Great, I've commissioned something on that. Great, I've commissioned something on that. Ooh, make a note of that." And Jo, being quite astute, "Are you writing books and you want?" No, I'm just doing magazines." So she said, "Well, if you were going to write a book, what are you drawn to? What do you think you'd write about?" And foolishly, I said, "Well, I'm really drawn to the liminal." "Oh," she says, "what's that?" "Well, you try explaining it. It's not easy." So I was trying to explain it, and she said, "Well, I think there's something in there, but you're not explaining it very well." Which I think's fair. So she was very interested. "Would you work up a proposal?" And I was thinking, I can't really work up a proposal because I don't really know what I would write about. But still there was that idea that this is something I'd like to know more about, and I suppose it was my journalist head kind of was thinking, well, maybe you could approach it from this angle, maybe you could approach it from that angle. And I would say to people, I'm really interested in the liminal, and I would start to explain, oh, liminal space, you know, it can be the physical, it could be the coastline, it could be a thin place, or it could be the metaphysical between sleep and wake, consciousness and unconsciousness. You know, we're talking about all these different things, and I could see people starting to glaze because they didn't have a point of reference. They didn't necessarily understand what I was talking about, and I wasn't explaining it very well. And then, of course, we all had March 2020, the pandemic hit. suddenly people who thought their lives were mapped out, people who thought their lives were going in a certain direction, everything stopped. All of us found ourselves in this place between the true, the stuff they knew, the stuff we were sure of, the familiar, but they didn't know what was coming. None of us knew what was coming, and none of us knew for sure what the future held. And that was a really uncomfortable place for many of us. Liminal space, those transitionary places, can be really discombobulating. You find yourself in this space and you're not sure of where you're going. And we like surety, we like homeostasis, we don't like change. There are some who embrace it, but not many. So suddenly, when I spoke to people about the liminal, I could say to people, how did you feel when everything that you knew and all that surety was taken away in the pandemic? People were like, oh, they understood. They understood that every single person had had their own experience of it. And for some people, that was a hard place to be. For many, many people, it was a hard place to be. But for some people, it was actually quite liberating. They found themselves in a place where the things that they had tied them, the labels that had told everybody who they were taken away. They were lifted. And in that space, they had time, they had a breath, they had a pause. And in the pause, they could look within. In that pause, they had time to examine where they were, where it was where they thought they would be, whether it was where they wanted to be, whether the things that they thought really mattered to them did indeed really matter to them. It made a bit more sense of the word liminal. So, Joe, never one to miss an opportunity, comes back and says, I think there might be something in this idea of yours. Can you work up a proposal? And it got me thinking. And it got me thinking about all those different areas of the liminal that we all experience, and how some of them are more important, or some of them have greater importance to us than others. So, when I started to think about it, I worked through, and I started from that point that suddenly we all understood, which was the pandemic, and I started with change. Change that's forced on us rather than change that we invite, and how we handle that. And I thought, I'm not an expert on this. This isn't something that I can set myself up as an expert on. I need the input from other people. Well, I had the gift of having been involved with Kindred Spirit for 20 years. So I reached out to some of the people in their own fields of expertise. And for the ones for change, I got in touch with people like John Parkin, who runs these courses. I think I better say the EFIT course rather than the name of it, but he runs courses where he wants people to have an EFIT moment where they take their hands off the steering wheel. And in that pause, they can reassess. I spoke to other people about change. The woman who'd actually thrown Abigail Bergstrom, and she'd written a book, and she had decided that she was this high-powered, highly successful woman. But in the pandemic, she had met her chap only weeks before, and they both decided that was it. They were going to take a chance on this, and of course you only could be in one place, couldn't you? So she moved in with him, gave up everything she knew, gave up her job, gave up everything, and found herself in this liminal space. Now, we don't all have to take on change quite as dramatically as that, and I'm not recommending it necessarily, but her insights, which are in the book, were fascinating about how inviting change, having a way of letting small bits of change into your life so that you become less resistant to change, can be really useful. So that was the sort of way into the book, perhaps because people understood this from the pandemic. So then I started to think, well, one of the obvious changes that people have, one of the most obvious, tangible representations of the liminal, being in that transition, is a rite of passage. What is a rite of passage if it's not moving from the person you were before, moving from the life you had before, going through some ceremony, some ritual, but often a challenge, often solitude where you have a chance to reassess, before you move on to that next stage. The ancients, traditional cultures, they all knew that these important points in your life, puberty, marriage, all of these different points, need to be celebrated, need to be marked, and the person going through them needs to recognise who they were before, where they're going. And they do that in this liminal space, in this unknown place, where everything that you normally rely on as identifiers for who you are taken away. And that's been really... So rites of passage for me are kind of like a little microcosm of what liminal space can be when we're talking in terms of change. So then I thought, well, what is the next rite? What is the next obvious metaphysical liminal for me? And the most obvious one when I thought about it was life and death. None of us escape this. We're all going to have this one movement into the liminal. And then I started thinking about who would I speak to about these, because obviously most of us here have really no experience of it. And I spoke to Felicity Warner, who's she's called a soul midwife, and she works with people as they're coming to the end of their lives and helps people and families with that transition. And I asked her about this place where people find themselves at the end, and her insights and her belief is that people move through a transition before them. You know, it's not 1 minute you're alive and 1 minute you're dead. There is a period. And this tied in, then I spoke to people who have done research into near-death experiences. And again, these same things came up, that there is this liminal space we enter. And I found it fascinating, because where are you? What is it? Where is this space that people enter when they have these near-death experiences, for example? Certainly, if you look at the science of it, it's inexplicable. If you have flatlined and your heart has stopped and there's no blood getting to the brain, and that's where consciousness lies, how can they have these vivid experiences? How does that happen? Where is this space? Where is this? This is all explored in the book. And of course that led me on to out-of-body experiences, because very often, for example, Dr. Penny Sartori, her research into NDEs was because she was an intensive care nurse. Now sometimes people, when they have these near-death experiences, they will have what's known as an out-of-body experience, where they're able to watch what's going on, and they're able to then report back at a later date. So that led me to talk to a wonderful expert called Samantha Lee Treasure, who's an expert, well, a researcher in it. Is anyone an expert in it? No. A researcher into out-of-body experiences. And again, very often with liminal, it gives you more questions than it gives you answers when you look into it. But we can draw our own thoughts about it. It's stuff that is worth giving thought to. It is stuff that's worth pondering, so that you come to your own conclusions on some of these things. These are the bigger questions maybe in life. Again, if you want to turn to some of the the wisdom traditions and the religions, you can look at Tibetan Buddhism, they talk about the bardo, which is this period between life and death. So these aren't new concepts that I'm talking about. These have been understood or talked about and looked into for many, many, many centuries and millennia. Of course, the whole thing about where are you, where is consciousness sighted, if when you flatline you're still able to have these vivid experiences, got me onto thinking about consciousness itself. The whole, what is consciousness? Oh my goodness, I was diving deep by this time. And at times I felt way out of my depth, but I spoke to some amazing people. Some people who could really give some insight into the liminality of consciousness. And when you think about the small, small part of our consciousness that we use, when there's all this stuff on the outer edge realms of our consciousness that is not explored as yet. But there are people who are looking into these things, people who actually voluntarily have out-of-body experiences, not rather than them happening in an emergency. People who want to explore consciousness by less dramatic routes. And so I talk to experts like Tony Peake, people like this, who have been looking into this for a long, long time. And we were going on a girls' night out not so long ago to the theatre, and I had a sort of, it was like a, you know, one of these where you have to make a pitch in a lift. They say, oh, what's your lift, what's your elevator pitch? And one of the friends in the back of the car said, well, I don't know what liminal space is. Tell me what it is. And why? Why are we even interested in it? What is the point in even looking into it? Which did kind of put me in the spotlight, rather, because I thought we were just going out for an evening out. And that's quite a hard one to answer, isn't it? Because what benefit is there to going further into what we can get from exploring the liminal when it comes to consciousness, for example? So what I would say in answer to that question is, I think it does vary for everyone. I think universally, in the main, when you talk to people who have had these near-death experiences, and not all, but a feeling of greater connection, a feeling of unity, a feeling of that there is a benign force, that there is a feeling of oneness. It supports the non-dualism argument. But there's so much more to know, so much more to learn. And you think about this, if you think of consciousness as a spectrum, we're only using a small part of it, and we're not really aware of what could be benefits that could come from exploring these liminal spaces on the edge that we don't really yet know about. But when I spoke to Daniel Pinchbeck, who's the philosopher, about it, I thought his answer was quite a good one, and he said, well, why do we climb mountains? Because they're there. Consciousness is unexplored, why would we not explore it? And I thought that's actually as good an answer as any when you're thinking of these, because there are benefits to understanding, having a greater understanding of who we are, because it gives you, when you do find that you're looking into these edge realms of the consciousness, it starts you asking questions about who we really are. It starts you asking some of the things that all of us can benefit from querying. And that's in the collective. If the whole collective started thinking a bit more readily about these things, it would benefit the whole planet. And that's when I started to move, actually, from the metaphysical into the physical, into the planet, into looking at things from the altered consciousness, to revisiting, I'm moving on a bit too fast there, because what I didn't tell you was that there's a whole chapter in there that looks at the ways that, there's very few people who are aesthetic enough to be able to be consciously in this altered state of consciousness or to access it. And not everyone would want to go down the route of trying the out-of-body experience, for example. But there are other ways you can do it. There are so many ways that are tried and trusted in terms of bringing about altered consciousness. So then we looked at not just meditation and other routes such as, shamanic drumming or those sorts of things, but also looking at aids such as the entheogens, whether they happen to be natural, like ayahuasca, iboga, psilocybin, or whether they were man-made. And there's so much research now on them, on DMT and LSD and the man-made ones, and so that led me to a whole new bunch of experts who were, all of them, I have to say, to a man, people I contacted, and I know they're busy people, and to a man, they were all enthusiastic and kind and generous with their time because it's things that they are passionate about. So they were very happy to talk and to give their insights into these things. One of the people that I spoke to was Bruce Parry, and he used to do a TV show called Tribe, and he had done iboga and ayahuasca, and he'd done various retreats. And one of the insights he gave into accessing an altered consciousness, going into this liminal, was that it gave him a chance to revisit past trauma, past actions, but to actually be able to view them from a more mature perspective and from a different perspective. And he found enormous, enormous benefit from that. And of course there were all sorts of self-revelations when he was in these states as well. I spoke to Dr. Mike Dow again. He's been working with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, helping people into altered consciousness, altered states, supported by psychotherapy. And from those places, they have had enormous, great results with people with depression who are treatment resistant. And very instant results, because there's a loss of ego when you're in these altered states. There's a loss of that ego identity. And there's all these self-realizations. It's, again, then there's this sense of connectedness, this expansive place that you go to, and a letting go, which he is convinced has amazing therapeutic benefits. Again, another aspect of liminality that I hadn't even considered at the beginning. From there, I think the hardest chapter for me to write was the chapter on divinity, spirituality, prayer. Obviously, when you send up prayer, when you do an invocation, when you do an affirmation, where are you sending it? Where do we think we are connecting to, if not the liminal? And what trust do we have? What faith do we have that those prayers, those invocations will be answered? That, for people who have been involved in it for a very long time, they found very hard to explain why we use those forms of prayer and invocation. What do we get from it when we live in such a scientific world where proof is needed for everything, where certainty is the bedrock of what we do? That takes a certain amount of being comfortable with not knowing. It takes a certain amount of trust to be able to put out those requests or whatever it is that you're sending out, and feeling that there is something or someone or whatever that is going to to help you. But you're putting yourself in a difficult, uncomfortable position because you've not got any certainty. You haven't got those answers that we rely on so heavily. So that was a difficult, for me, chapter to talk about. So again, we went from that to the metaphysical, from the metaphysical to the physical. We talked about liminal times of day, liminal times in the calendar, liminal times in the seasons. Why are we drawn to those cusp times? Why do people tend to do their rituals at dawn or dusk, on the cross quarters? Why are we drawn to these festivals that we all have, the solstices and the equinoxes? And most of the wisdom traditions will tell you it's because these are the ideal times. It's when there's this thinning between the worlds. And there's a thinning of the veil. It's when you feel more in touch with whatever is out there, whatever your beliefs are. It's when it aids the awareness. It aids you. Those times help you to let go and have that connection. And those are the liminal times of the calendar, the natural calendar, of the days, of the seasons. And again, in the book, what we touch on is why would you do it? What are the benefits of doing it then? Why should we all try and get more in touch with those times? Because there are subtle influences at these times and points in our calendars. Now, whether we choose to listen to them or not, they are still there. Whether you want to tune into those subtle energies or not, but if you do, these are the ideal times to do it. And then I got on to the chapter that I really wanted to write, and the one that I found most straightforward to write in many ways, but again, not always easy to explain, which was the places in the world where you are in the liminal. And it took me back to that time in Corfe Castle where I felt that, the time when I was in the Highlands, and I felt something greater than myself. I felt in touch with something. I felt in awe. I felt... It's so hard to explain, isn't it? I'm sure many of you have had these experiences, and it's so hard to put into words what it is when you touch into these liminal places. Anywhere that moves you into that place of awe, that engulfs you, that takes you over, that is a thin place or in a liminal place. So this chapter was a wonderful one to write, I have to say. It not only connects you to something outside of you, but it connects you to something within. And that's the strength of being in these places. And there's obviously stuff in the book that will talk to you about how you find thin places or where they are. And I think a lot of it is about letting go of expectations, because, you know, there are lots of things written about thin places, and if you go there with an expectation, it may not work for you. And I have to say, you know, I have always wanted these connections in places, and I go searching for them, and sometimes when in the most likely places, like Stonehenge, I mentioned in the book, no connection whatsoever. Find myself in the standing stones of Callanish on the Isle of Lewis, and was just absolutely blown away. It was the most numinous experience. It was wonderful. So everyone will find their own thin places. And the other thing that I thought that many of us feel drawn to is it has not lost its appeal. We think of pilgrimage as something from the olden times. It has not lost its appeal. Modern pilgrimage is on the increase. But what is a pilgrimage if it's not setting off from what you know, setting off from home, travelling to a destination, a known point? But many of the revelations of a pilgrimage, the strength of a pilgrimage, happen on the journey. That is the strength of the liminal. So putting yourself into that position where things can happen, putting yourself into a position where things can be allowed. Finally, I talk about the world is being in a liminal place in terms of the ecological crises that we face. I'm running out of time. I'm getting the nod, so I won't go into any depth on that. But I was just going to quickly tell you that this book, I've written many books. This book started off, but talk about life imitating art, or the other way around. In this case, art imitating life. I'm writing about the liminal, and I start this book, and I find myself in a liminal space where I really thought, I'm going to have to give back this advance. I can't write this book. I don't know how it's going to work. And that was a very strange place for somebody who's written a lot of books. It was a very uncomfortable place. But whilst writing, I had a light bulb moment where I thought, this has to be about, almost like a documentary. This book is going to be about the people that I meet on the way. I don't have, it can't be a didactic text. I can't be an expert. I don't believe there really are many experts on liminality. There are experts within their field who have views on it. And those are the people I drew on. And so the book became a journey as well. And from that uncomfortable place, that liminal place, as I suspected, the light bulb moment came, and the book took shape as it is, and I have to say I'm very proud and pleased with it. But that was another experience for me of the liminal, and just allowing and trusting, and sure enough the answers came. So again, to finish, why might we want to spend time in the liminal? Why should we be interested in it? I think if you can embrace the liminal more often, there are opportunities within for self-discovery, for greater understanding, for connection, and for curiosity. It's what we need in life, it's curiosity, and the liminal is there waiting for all those who are curious. And I think there are many opportunities for inspiration, creativity, and greater self-understanding if you're happy to put yourself into the liminal. So thank you very much for bearing with me and going through that. It was a quick spin through some of the stuff that we touch on in the book.
And the liminal spaces, are they always, in your opinion, or experiences that you've noted, good spaces?
That's interesting. My own experience of liminal space is that they have been overwhelmingly good. And I did speak to, and I should point out as well at the beginning that my experiences that I'm talking about tend to be in nature, but of course they don't have to be. And people can experience them in places in the edge, sacred buildings, ruins as well. So that's just so that you don't get the impression that they're only in nature. When I spoke to Glennie Kindred about this, and I said, you know, again, like you, is it always good to be in the liminal? Have you ever had bad experiences? And she, and I echo this, said, well, her experiences have usually been good, but if she ever picks something up where she's fearful, where you don't get that feeling of awe, you get a feeling of discomfort and slight fear, then it's not a good place to be. And she will remove herself from those places pretty quickly, and I would do the same. So you can't say categorically no that the liminal is universally good. You have to be aware. But I would say that when I found myself in those places where you get that feeling of awe, that is definitely a thin place, a liminal place. Anybody else got a question?
Let's ask you, do you think the liminal place is something that every place can be liminal place? It depends how it interacts with your energy. The place decides to reveal the liminal side to you.
Yes,
do
I
you
do.
find?
Yeah, definitely I find that. I think what's liminal for one person, not necessarily for somebody else. And also there's this wonderful thing that if you go, if you think you've read, oh, that's a thin place, that's a liminal place, I want to go there. I would say you can feel drawn to various places, and you should listen to that. But if you're going because it is somewhere to tick off, it's probably not going to work for you. You know, somewhere has to be something that you resonate with, and it's a bit like again with going on pilgrimage. People think, oh, it's got to be challenging, it's got to be hundreds of miles, and it's got to be difficult. No, that's not necessarily pilgrimage. What's important about the pilgrimage is the intention when you set off. It's that feeling of allowing, being open to stuff that can happen, and it doesn't have to be to a sacred site. It could be to somewhere that has meaning for you from your childhood. The destination is almost, I won't say irrelevant, but it's not the be-all and end-all. What's important is the intention when you go on your pilgrimage. And just as you say, you can find those thin places, you can find what can be revealed in liminality on a pilgrimage near home. It could be, you know, a lake you used to go to and it's only 10 miles away with your parents. But it has meaning for you, and that walk then becomes a pilgrimage in many ways.
Quick question about consciousness, and is a dream a liminal space?
Now that's really interesting. I should pass this over to Samantha. She's better equipped to answer this one. What's interesting is that a dream is a liminal space, but it's not the same as the place that you visit when you have a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience. It has its dreamlike quality, and it's definitely... So I had said to Dr. Penny Sartori, for example, well, because she said, oh, well, people dismiss NDEs as hallucinations. The medical profession will just put them in a blanket term. It's a hallucination. It is not a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience. And being the journalist, I said, well, that doesn't sound unreasonable. What is the difference? You know, why couldn't it be a hallucination? How do we prove otherwise? And although it's kind of empirical evidence rather than scientific evidence, the experiences that people have when they're in an NDE or when they're in an OBE are very different from those of a hallucination. The qualities are very, very different. They're very much clearer, they're very much live, and they don't fade, and they often are life-altering. Whereas a hallucination or a dream they change, the memory of it changes, it fades, and it has that odd dream-like quality where you could have I don't know, Mickey Mouse's ears whilst you're in the middle of it. That is not the experience of an NDE or an OBE.
I was a little bit late, so maybe I missed this. I'm interested in the relationship between time and liminal space. So, what would you suggest? Like, how long should we spend in to get something to happen too much?
It's quite a tricky question, because people feel, like Denise Lim was saying, you know, to have a connection, if you go in to do a vision quest, for example, you know, normally you would go for 3 days, and during that time you would have multiple experiences where you would put yourself in this liminal space and you would have revelations over that period. But as we all know, or it's becoming better known or better understood, is that time is elastic. You don't have to have a set period of time for your meditation. You don't have to have a set period of time for your vision quest. You don't have to put yourself a time limit on things. The intention you set when you enter that liminal space is what generally gives you the quality of the liminal experience, rather than the time that you allow for it. So the relationship between time and the liminal is very elastic and fluid. A lot of it comes from, again, the allowing, the letting in, and the intention when you want to experience these things.
We're going to give you a round of applause.
Thank you.